second scripture today is from the prophet Micah, chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. Hear what the Lord says: "Rise, plead your case before the mountains. Let the hills hear your voice. Hear, you mountains, the controversy of the Lord, and you enduring foundations of the earth. For the Lord has a controversy with his people, and he will contend with Israel. O my people, what have I done to you? In what have I wearied you? Answer me. For I brought you up from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery. I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. O my people, remember now what King Balak of Moab devised, what Balaam, son of Beor, answered him, and what happened from Shittim to Gilgal, that you may know the saving acts of the Lord. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." I had a church member in Albany named Kathy. Kathy was a single mom with a early elementary school-aged child. She was working a full-time job and she was going to college, all at the same time. She had a dream. Kathy wanted to be an elementary school teacher. She was wonderful with kids, and she was driven to get to that goal. She was serious about her classes. She worked very, very hard and did everything that she needed to do to get to the point where the things would go the way she wanted them to go. And every month or so, Kathy would come to see me, and she would vent about her fellow classmates. She would come in and she would roll her eyes and she would talk about these kids, and obviously she was in a different place than many of her classmates. Many of them had come straight from high school. They really didn't know what they wanted out of life, and they were just kind of there. And she was driven. And so she would roll her eyes and she would complain about them, and I would commiserate, and she'd go back and do the work that she had to do. Well, one day she came in and she told me a story that I have to tell you I was flabbergasted about. She came in and she said in one of her classes they had been assigned a 4-page paper. Now, at that point in time, I was working on my dissertation. And I couldn't imagine how anyone could say anything of any value at all in only 4 pages. You know, that's like asking a Baptist preacher to preach for 4 minutes. It takes that long to introduce yourself. Well, it got worse. She said, we had a 4-page paper assigned to us. And the day before the paper was due in class, one of my classmates raised his hand and he said, "Teacher, would 1 page be enough?" I was flabbergasted. I didn't know what to say. Yes. But it is a typical human trait, isn't it? To want to find out what the bare minimum is that you have to do or be to meet the requirements. Is that the best price you can give me on that? You can't go any lower? How about if I put in this amount of effort? Will that be enough to get me through? If I work this hard, is that really the deadline? Or is there a grace period for a few days after if I'm a little bit late? How many hours do I have to work? Really? You want me to make this many visits in a day? Can't I get away with 2 less than that? What do I have to do? What is the very minimum amount that I have to do to meet the requirements? And of course, the same thing, we do it in our spiritual lives, don't we? What is the minimum that I have to do to find fulfillment? To find peace, to find meaning, to find purpose in life? What is the very minimum that I have to do to feel like I am a whole person? As a pastor, I'm part of an institution, and I've got answers for that, don't I? And indeed, that institution is very important to me because obviously if the institution fails, then I'm out of a career. And indeed, there are lots of folk who are avoiding church work because they're worried that the institution is failing. But because of that all, I immediately find myself running to those institutional answers. What do you do to be a good follower of Jesus? Well, you go to church on Sunday. You all are in the right place. You're getting there. And when the little offering plate went around, you put something in there. And the bigger it is, the better it works out. Maybe you come on Wednesday evening to the gathering, and you might find yourself listening to Cheryl in a few weeks when she stands up and says, we're going to need volunteers for the Easter egg hunt. And so you say, yes, I will be there and I will help. And you'll put some more money in the little piggy bank that takes money for the Easter egg hunt. You'll attend church events. You'll invite friends and bring them. All of those institutional answers, they're easy answers. We can look at them. We can quantify them. We may not like them. We may not even do them. There are lots of folk who believe all of those things, and they don't ever come to church. But then at least when they're not happy or fulfilled or self-actuated, they know why. Because they didn't do what they knew they were supposed to do. Of course, we live in a culture that doesn't trust institutions anymore, does it? And indeed, there is good reason for that. We know that those answers in and of themselves aren't really enough. You can go to church. You can put 50% of your income in that plate as it goes by every Sunday, and I'm not telling you shouldn't do that. You can come to every event we have. You can volunteer for every task. You can be out there catching gophers every Saturday. And still feel as empty as a deflated balloon. And so people search in all kinds of other places. I have friends who are into crystals. You probably know some people who are into crystals. Friends who go to drum circles every week, who meditate daily. Some folk who go in less spiritual kinds of directions to try to find fulfillment. And instead they work at piling up more and more stuff and amassing more and more power so they can have influence over other people. They like to go and party. And all of those things are just symptoms of that need to feel whole. And so the question comes again, what must I do to find shalom, to find the wholeness that God yearns each of us experience. It was a real question in Micah's day. Micah comes from that same period of prophecy, that golden age of prophecy that we've talked about a couple of times over the past few weeks. And he lived in a culture that was as corrupt as any has ever been, with the rich taking advantage over the poor. He speaks in another place of the rich lying awake in bed at night, trying to think up new and more effective ways to steal from the poor. And then as soon as they get out of bed in the next morning, they run off to do what they dreamt that night. The divide between the haves and the have-not was as wide as ever. There was no sense of community responsibility, no sense of compassion, no sense that I am my brother's keeper. Instead, each person was out for themselves. And those who had advantages did a lot better. Wealth was portrayed as a sign of God's blessings. Those with wealth were seen as being on God's side. They deserved what they had because they had worked hard. They had talents that obviously came from God. And most important of all, if they were wealthy, that was a sign that they were righteous. And the questions weren't ever really asked about how the wealth got there or stayed there. To make things worse, the religious institutions of the day were intimately tied to those same power structures, from the very top all the way down. The high priest was a position that, in effect, someone purchased. So to become high priest, you had to have resources or backers. And once you became high priest, you had power to either allow people to approach God or to stop them from approaching God. It was the high priest who defined what requirements for sacrifice people made. And if the high priest gave those requirements, then the high priest also had the power to say, you can find forgiveness and you can't. Imagine if someone comes and the high priest says, Cheryl, 2 pigeons for you. 2 pigeons, that's not bad. Jessica, you need a bull without any blemishes. Well, that's a big difference. And Joan, how about 1,000 rams? Well, some people can meet those requirements and some can't. Only the very wealthy can afford or find a bull without blemish. And you can imagine how many sins a bull without blemish can cover. Micah looked at this situation and he saw the judgment of God coming. He had left his small hometown to come to the big city of Jerusalem to preach God's judgment against this system. And the people responded, and the religious institutions responded, and they said, what do you mean? We're doing exactly what God requires. We go to temple every week. We make all of the appropriate offerings. We do what God wants us to do. And yet Micah kept preaching, you're not meeting what God wants. And finally, the people got frustrated and they said, Micah, what in the world are we supposed to do? What does God want? We're already doing all of these things that the institution says. What are we doing wrong? And Micah says, here's the answer. Here's what God requires. Do justice. Love kindness. And walk humbly with God. He doesn't have a list of religious institutional requirements. He doesn't have a list of things that you've got to check off and say, I believe this and this and this and this. He doesn't even say you have to be Jewish. He just says, do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God. Now, the translation that I read is pretty typical of it, of the ones that we're all familiar with. You might have seen one that instead of saying love kindness says love mercy. But those three words are pretty much what we hear. The problem is that they're not the best translations from the Hebrew. And the English leaves a lot to be desired when you compare it to what the Hebrew is really saying. Micah is telling the people that they need to become God's blessed community together, doing what is right, being faithful and constant on the side of those who live on the margins, and always, always, always aware of the presence of God. And so when he says, do justice, he's saying, be aware of the context of actions and respond appropriately. It made me think of how historically in the Middle East, the punishment for theft was to have your hand cut off, unless your family was starving, and then there was no punishment. On the one hand, it looks like a very severe punishment. On the other hand, we wonder how there would be no punishment. It includes this question of what is really going on? Look at the whole context of the actions. But he goes further than that, and it always stands on the side of those on the margins. Because, again, this was a situation where justice was for sale. And if justice is for sale, then it's only the poor who don't get it. So doing justice means standing with them. And realizing that not only do some people suffer because of injustice, there are some folk who benefit because of injustice. And doing justice then requires an adjustment there. Makes me think of the folk who are born on third base and find it very, very easy to make a home run, but don't understand how difficult it is for someone who's born in the dugout and doesn't even have access to a bat. And justice says, you got to shake those things up. And the person on third base doesn't get to stay on third base. And the person in the dugout gets a bat. And so the justice is always slanted for those without the resources to get justice for themselves. Kindness, mercy, that sounds easy. We know what it looks like to be kind. You talk about that with Corwin. Tell him, don't hit your mama. He didn't. He was just playing. But again, the translation falls short. Because the word implies patience. It implies giving even when the other doesn't deserve it. It's recalled in Jesus' teaching to his disciples when they ask him, well, Jesus, how many times are we supposed to forgive these people? And he says, 70 times 7. You do kindness until you have nothing left. And then you do more. And this kindness, this mercy is such that it is always there. It is always there. Walking humbly is a reminder that we are not God. And we do not know what is on God's mind. No matter how sure we are about something, it reminds us that there always has to be a little bit of humility back here in the back of our mind that says, yeah, I could be wrong. And I better be aware of that. And if that's a possibility, then I must always err on the side of loving, of forgiving, of caring, of trusting, of giving, of doing justice, of standing with those who are hurting the most. I saw one of my friends posted an ad on Facebook the other day, excuse me, for a church looking for a new pastor. And it was an Anabaptist church. Anabaptists are the historic peace churches. And I read through the thing, and I thought, this is really wonderful. And there was a lot of really great stuff in this about this church. It was very, looked like a wonderful place to be. And then I was reading, and it had a statement about gay and lesbian folk that basically said, you aren't welcome here. And I looked at that and I thought, how in the world can you say you're a church that is devoted to peace and then do that kind of violence to someone? And I thought, at the very least, they need to err on the side of welcome and caring and loving. And if they're going to be wrong, they better not be wrong on pushing people away. Excuse me. If we want to be whole, fulfilled, happy, all that we can be, it's not do's and don'ts. It's not institutional structures, but it is relationships with God and with each other that are based in justice and kindness and humility. Now, as a pastor, I need to talk about church a little bit. Excuse me. And while it's true that the institutional answers aren't enough in and of themselves, and that finding God or finding ourselves isn't found in those simple answers. But the reality is that we do need institutional structures and support to do those things as we need to do them. And it just so happens that, at least in its best incarnation, that church is one institution, maybe even the only institution that embodies that possibility. That's the place where we go and we are challenged and supported to do justice and to love kindness and to find a sense of humility. That's the place where we go and together we encounter God and we encounter one another in all of our wonder and glory and brokenness. And so as the institution of church realizes that the institution is just there as a means of support for the human concerns, for the journey of God's people together. And then we find support and challenge to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly. And as we do that, we find that indeed we are made whole. We do find purpose and direction and peace and shalom. What does God require? What does God want? Is for each of us to be all that we can be. And that is how we get there.